And of course, one of the major themes of the book is that if you do not allow markets to operate the way they are supposed to operate, the markets are going to provide the wrong signals. And I mean, right now, for example, with such extremely low interest rates as reported, people have no incentive to save, which of course is one of the main issues that we have to face in the economy. I mean, if you want to develop the economy, people have to save, and that is the way we're going to be able to accumulate capital stock. Yet, people think that it is wonderful that we have these extremely low interest rates.
Well, yeah, I'm old enough to remember the 70s.
Right.
And you'd think that there might have been more investment to offset the so-called malaise induced by Jimmy Carter, but the interest rates were not what they appeared to be.
Right.
Now, let me get more specific. I have some familiarity, along with the rest of you, with economic statistics, and so I really appreciated your emphasis on the numbers and the information, how they're interpreted. What about inflation? What about unemployment? It seems to me that both of those are systematically underestimated.
Absolutely.
And that has a lot to do with how the government operates, because the underestimates were actually validated by acts of Congress some years back.
Right.
And yet people view them as being the basis for real decisions. What's your take on that?
Well, this goes beyond the book, because this is information that appeared actually today in the media. It has been reported that labor force participation in the American economy has decreased by something like 3 million people. Obviously, these are individuals who have been unable to find a job, and since they have been unable to find a job, they have withdrawn from the labor force. Therefore, they are not counted officially as being unemployed. Therefore, what people say, well, we have an unemployment rate of 9.6. Well, it's really not 9.6. In addition to the people counted, there are 3 million people who have withdrawn from the labor force, and therefore, in effect, they are unemployed. They would like to have a job. They were part of the labor force, before this disaster struck. So, I mean, it's a point, very well taken, that the media, again, is failing to inform the people that the magnitude of the crisis that we're facing right now is much greater than people realize.
Yeah, and not to mention the great percentage of long-term unemployed, but that's another issue. The inflation rate, is built into law that there should be annual increases for senior citizens,
Right.
For Social Security payments. So it makes a big difference whether the inflation rate as it's computed is more or less valid, more valid or less valid.
Peter, I would like Chris
Yes.
maybe to talk a little bit about changes in the monetary base, and Chris, if you would like to talk about that.
Yes.
Well, there's a hot issue. We were just talking about that before coming in here.
Absolutely.
The British are, in the Financial Times, are publishing the latest Fed policy as QE2. And you can explain it.
All right, excellent. Well, before I go into that, I just want to briefly comment on the unemployment situation. One of the things we face, in addition to the high unemployment that's reported in the newspaper, is underemployment. And the real issue with underemployment is individuals who would like to perhaps move from part-time employment to full-time employment. This number is somewhere in the area of 16 to 17% right now is reported. So again, we're talking about almost 1 out of 6 people in the labor force who are experiencing underemployment. And this is a significant issue. Now, moving into the monetary base, one of the things that we've seen develop in the last few years as a response to the financial crisis is a dramatic growth in the money supply. I believe the money supply has grown to about $1.9 trillion, and that's an M2 measure. And this is very significant because it can lead to possible inflationary scenarios, so it at least raises the probability of inflation occurring in the future.
Yes, and you've got a hockey stick type of graph in here that I was looking for,
Yes,
which
it's
shows
At the end of chapter 2.
it's a very dramatic graph.
the end of chapter 2.
At the very end, the last page of chapter 2.
In the
There we are.
All right.
Look at that incredibly steep rise in the money supply in that graph. We can see it at this distance. Anyway, one of many pictures in the book. Now, why don't we turn to one of the issues addressed in the book? I mentioned education. I mentioned health. And I didn't mention the auto industry.
Oh, that's right. The work of what the unions did to the auto industry. So
Now, which one of you worked on the auto industry?
Right, that was me.
Okay. Well, I'm wondering, what do you really think of the auto so-called bailout? I mean, should that have been undertaken or not?
No. Pretty definitively, that's the short answer. We actually fielded that question before the bailouts when we were giving talks to alumni clubs. I believe we took the question in Hartford, but we had been giving talks to alumni clubs on the Eastern Seaboard. And we took that question, should the auto companies be allowed to fail? And the answer in our mind is yes. Bankruptcy would have provided them with legal tools to restructure without distorting market incentives, which is what we fear happened with the bailout. It favored different groups within the reorganization of the companies. It was obviously politically
Not to mention
motivated.
screwing some of the creditors.
That's correct. So, I mean,
Bondholders.
we by providing a government bailout and having the government step in rather than allowing the proceedings of bankruptcy to occur unaltered, we kind of distorted the incentives within the structure of Detroit, and that seems to be a theme throughout many cases of government intervention within our crisis recently and even in the past, where their intervention, for whatever political reasons or whatever perceived benefits, actually distorted market incentives that would have otherwise created ultimately equilibrium conditions. So people are afraid of the adjustments within a market to get to equilibrium, and they usually have government step in, but we strongly oppose it.
But this question came up to candidates for Congress, and I was one of them. What do you say to someone who says, but you had to do it because it's such an important part of this country's industrial base, and our manufacturing sector has already gone into the tank? What do you say?
You get into kind of nationalist arguments there where you're worried about our individual workers, but the bottom line is in economics there's a concept of comparative advantage, and now assuming, and this is a large assumption, that there's free trade, and maybe Professor Sanchez can elaborate on the issues in international trade later, but assuming that there's free trade, real free trade between nations, if we are at a comparative disadvantage compared to other producers of certain goods, then there's a substantial economic argument to say that we shouldn't be involved in it anymore, or at least in those parts of manufacturing that we don't have a comparative advantage at. So we had an advantage in certain auto production, and the Japanese had an advantage at others, but our companies didn't read the markets, the companies didn't read the markets properly, and they had inflated labor costs as a result of politicized unions. And ultimately they weren't competitive. And the bankruptcy, or the impending bankruptcy, was the market signaling to those companies that they had failed, and that's where we really stood on the issue.
And what about the auto fuel mileage standards, so-called CAFE, or CAFE?
that was his section.
I'm going to pass that
One
off to
question
Chris.
left over from my reading of your take on this in the book, a question that cropped up, and I don't think you addressed it in this section, is why didn't the American companies, GM, Chrysler, Ford, the big three at least, why didn't they adapt to those standards by finding more innovative and productive ways to manufacture the smaller, more fuel-efficient cars?
Yeah, and that question can be answered in a number of ways. But when you look at the huge capital costs associated with converting factories and completely retooling your product line, it's kind of like if you told GE that every refrigerator they made had to be completely rebuilt. There's a tremendous research and development costs that need to go in. And those costs were absorbed, but in the process, significant market share was lost, and it put the companies at a disadvantage.